or the protester way? Who do you want to run the government? Conservatives aligned with Senator Collins, trying to work toward empowering people, make us safe, more money in your pocket? Or do you want to turn your government over to people who just yell and spit on you?
Providing us reporting this hour, NBC's Garrett Hake. He's on Capitol Hill for us. PBS's Yamiche Alcindor and Eugene Scott from the Washington Post, also on our nation's Capitol for us. Garrett, with a good morning. Let's start with you here. What all are we expecting to see on Capitol Hill today?
Alex, we're going to see Democrats continue to try to push back against this vote and against Brett Kavanaugh today, even though the numbers are in, and this is, as you said earlier, essentially a fait accompli. But you will see Democrats continue to highlight Judge Kavanaugh's record as a judge, the questions raised about him, the allegations made about him by Dr. Ford and others throughout the course of the day. And we expect to see continued protests both in the Capitol buildings and around the Washington, D.C. area as Democrats and those resisting this appointment will continue to do everything they can to draw attention to it, even though the politics are essentially set moving forward. We saw floor speeches going all through the night last night. Those will continue today. We expect to see a vote maybe around 4 or 5 o'clock this afternoon, although it could happen sooner if Republicans decide not to use all of their speaking time, knowing that they in fact have the votes. A couple interesting moments from yesterday that I think set the tone going into today. First, Susan Collins delivering what ended up being really the closing argument in favor of Judge Kavanaugh. Not just a yes vote, not a quiet yes vote like we saw from Jeff Flake, but really a full-throated endorsement of the judge surrounded by other female Republican senators. It was meant to be an image that projected unity there by Republicans and meant to be the closing argument to get Judge Kavanaugh across the finish line. And on the other side, there was Lisa Murkowski, the lone Republican senator who voted against Judge Kavanaugh. Last night, she explained her decision, and she talked a little bit about Kavanaugh's judicial record, a lot about the concerns raised by Dr. Ford, and even more about the process and what she said has become an entirely too polarized, too negative process of confirming judicial nominees. Here's a portion of her speech from late last night.
After the hearing that we all watched last week, last Thursday, it became clear to me, or was becoming clearer, that appearance of impropriety has become unavoidable.
Murkowski talked about adding a little bit more grace, a little bit more personal comity to this process. She said she wanted to demonstrate that today in a bit of Senate procedural trickery here. Not really trickery, but a bit of taking advantage of Senate procedure here. She will vote present today rather than vote no as she did yesterday in what's called a pair to allow Steve Daines, a fellow Republican senator, he from Montana, to attend his daughter's wedding and not have to fly back in the middle of the night to cast her vote. She said that's the kind of personal grace we should be showing each other, the kind of thoughtfulness we should be showing each other as these nominations are debated. She wanted to demonstrate that. This isn't something that will change the overall vote ratio, although it will change historically how this vote is counted. And that was part of something Murkowski wanted to have be her mark on this process that she has seen be so far off the rails. Alex.
Garrett, I appreciate all that reporting. We're just getting word that Melania Trump is in Cairo. She's taking questions and answering things about Brett Kavanaugh. Let's take a listen, everyone.
And yesterday, there's been some discussion about your hat yesterday.
You know what?
Today,
we just completed an amazing trip. We went to Ghana, we went to Malawi, we went to Kenya. Here we are in Egypt. I want to talk about my trip and not what I wear. And that's very important. What I do, what we're doing with USAID, and what I do with my initiatives. And I wish people would focus on what I do, not what I wear.
What was your biggest accomplishment? Your trip is wrapping up. We're on the last day. What was your biggest accomplishment, do you think, here in the continent of Africa?
Meeting with these people and thanking me for that I came. And they were all very warm and welcoming. And I saw successful programs that USAID is providing to the countries, and we are helping them on the journey for self-reliance.
Are you planning any other trips like this going forward? Any other international trips like this?
First, we need to come home, and then we will send maybe another one.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, of course, we were listening to that in the control booth, everybody, and we, of course, missed the exact verbiage that she gave relative to Brett Kavanaugh, but she said that she has her own voice, she speaks for herself, and she has sympathy and support for women everywhere. That, according to Melania Trump there, as she was wrapping up her trip to Africa, speaking there in Cairo. So, again, this expected vote around 5 p.m. Eastern, as Garrett was telling us. Garrett also made the point this could come a little bit earlier in the latter part of the 4 p.m. hour. We have the main Democrat, though, on the hot seat for breaking with others, that being Senator Joe Manchin. Take a listen.
I watched it, and then I made my decision, and I gave my reasons for my decision. Ours went out, and we want to make sure.
Are you going to listen to the people here?
Sure. No, I'm very much concerned, basically, with the sexual abuse that people have had to endure, and very much concerned that we have to do something as a country. So I had to deal with the facts I had in front of me.
Let's go now to Democratic Senator Gary Peters of Michigan. Senator, with a good morning to you, sir, on this very busy and long day. You have Senator Manchin, who says that he believes something happened to Dr. Ford, but the facts do not show that she was sexually assaulted specifically by Brett Kavanaugh. And you tweeted, quote, I found Dr. Ford's testimony before the Judiciary Committee compelling and credible. While I'm opposed to Judge Kavanaugh's nomination because of his rulings that are hostile to Michigan workers and our environment, the nation deserves to have more facts about the allegations. So where do you come down in terms of reflecting the opinion of Senator Manchin?
Well, you know, every senator has to make their own decision based on the facts that they see, the evidence they see, and certainly I respect Senator Manchin's decision. I may not agree with it, but I respect it. And, you know, ultimately, especially on a vote of this magnitude, we all have to vote based on what we feel is right. And when we look in the mirror in the morning, it's got to be something that we're comfortable with. And obviously, Senator Manchin made that decision, which was a very difficult decision for him.
Do you think you would have voted yes if these allegations were the only issue that was standing in the way of his confirmation and not those about the specific to workers in Michigan that you have cited?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, he did not make any comments before. I know he was weighing all of the different issues and coming up with his ultimate decision. Certainly what we have seen these last couple of weeks and the allegations that have been made weighed very heavily on his mind, and I know that was a big consideration for him. But I couldn't possibly say whether or not he would have come down differently had this not occurred.
Would you support a House investigation at the start for an impeachment vote into Judge Kavanaugh, something that has been suggested by your Democratic colleague in the House, Jerry Nadler?
Well, I think there are other things that the House should be investigating, and that should be the focus. We have to do our due diligence as Congress to be a check on the executive. That's how our framers envisioned this government working, that the Congress would be a check on the executive. There are a number of other things we should be looking at, including, I think, the tax returns that have now come to light publicly of President Trump, some of the other actions of his administration. There's a lot of work for us to do should we take back either the House or the Senate.
There are many of your fellow Democrats, sir, who say that Kavanaugh's confirmation to the highest court sends a very poor message to women and also to survivors of sexual assault. I want to have us listen to that.
How you can come to the floor, as many Republicans have, and say, we believe Dr. Christine Ford, but in the end of the day, we really just can't bring ourselves to the point of believing that it could have been Brett Kavanaugh.
Ours was an investigation to figure out enough about what happened to determine if Brett Kavanaugh is fit to serve on the highest court in our land. Is he fit to be a jurist? That is our role when it comes to Dr. Ford's allegations. And we fell short. We fell short. We did not do her justice. We did not do the American people justice.
To confirm Judge Kavanaugh under these circumstances would send a powerful message that the Senate, and now possibly the Supreme Court, is a hostile environment for survivors of sexual assault.
I have never been angrier or sadder as a member of the United States Senate because it is the result of a cover-up.
Do you agree with what was said there? Senator Kamala Harris, she said that the United States Senate as a body has fallen short. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think we did fall short in doing the kind of thorough investigation that these allegations certainly warranted, not just Dr. Ford, but other allegations that came forward. We would hope that an FBI background investigation would have been thorough. It was clear that it was not, that it was very limited in scope. As I reviewed those documents, there were a lot of questions that were raised, and I kept asking myself, why weren't the FBI following these leads? Why weren't they following these questions to find out some answers? So,
Senator, do you have an answer to that question? Do you know why the FBI was not following those leads that you found quite obvious as you were going over the FBI findings?
Well, I think, perhaps the White House constrained some of that investigation, but it was also the time. That was a very short period of time. There should have been more time for a thorough investigation. And certainly women in this country want to make sure, as they should, that they are heard, their voices are truly heard, and that these allegations are investigated properly. We did not see that in this case.
During this whole week, we have been reminded of Anita Hill and all that happened nearly 30 years ago. Of course, we know that Clarence Thomas was confirmed to the Supreme Court there, despite being accused of sexual harassment. Do you see parallels here?
Well, I think we all see parallels here, and we saw that parallel play out here without a thorough investigation, which we should have to try to get to the facts. And then I think I was taken aback, too, by just the hyper-partisanship that we saw out of Judge Kavanaugh when he had his testimony. We have now someone going to the Supreme Court, if the Republicans vote the way we all expect them to do today, who is now going to bring a far-right perspective that's going to hurt women, it's going to hurt working people, it's going to be bad for the environment. We need to have a neutral, fair arbiter in the Supreme Court as much as we can, and that means we need to have Supreme Court justices that are somewhere around the middle, that will be able to look at things in a dispassionate way. We don't have that with Judge Kavanaugh. Clearly, this is a major shift to the right, and now not only taints the court, but brings a hyper-partisan aspect to the court that certainly is counter to the way this branch of government was designed by our founders.
Democratic Senator Gary Peters of Michigan, I very much enjoyed our conversation. Please come see me again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's bring in our panel, Yamiche Alcindor and Eugene Scott. Big welcome to you both. You just heard the senator there. Do you agree with his assessment, the last things that he was saying there, Yamiche?
I mean, I can't, as a reporter, talk about whether or not I agree with whether or not the Senate failed to do or fell short.
No, but the fact that we now are without a moderate voice, that we have a divide that is 5-4 in favor of conservative voices now on the Supreme Court, if everything goes according to plan today.
Yes, that, of course, is very true, that Brett Kavanaugh is someone who wasn't just a judge who had conservative rulings, but he was a judge who worked with Republicans, who worked inside an administration, who worked very closely with George Bush. So, yes, the court is definitely going to be changed forever, which is why you had Democrats. There was, of course, outrage because of Dr. Ford's allegations, but there was outrage long before that because Justice Kennedy was seen as this moderate voice who kind of gave the Supreme Court this idea that you could swing one way or the other. Now, we're likely going to see a lot of 6-3 decisions, 6 Republicans versus 3 Democrats, when before we used to see a lot of 5-4, and they would swing back and forth.
What about Senator Manchin's decision, Eugene? Because based on your reporting there, what do you think was the deciding factor in his case?
I think he was thinking about his voters. West Virginia is a state that overwhelmingly went for Donald Trump. And I remember seeing footage earlier this week, I believe, where Manchin was perhaps at a parade in a town in West Virginia. And voters were incredibly respectful, but yelling out at him that they wanted him to support Kavanaugh. And I remember one gentleman in particular saying, if you vote no, I will not vote for you. And I think he wanted to represent the views of his voters more so than the views of his party as a whole.
Do you think, Yamiche, there weren't many expectations from Manchin because of what Eugene's saying there? He's in a red state.
I think there are a lot of expectations for Joe Manchin, mainly because you see Senator Lisa Murkowski saying that she changed her mind on the way to the chamber. She's someone who has voted with her party. She voted for Neil Gorsuch. So there was every intention that she was likely going to vote for Brett Kavanaugh until these accusations came up. And it was with that everything changed. So I think that there are a lot of senators. You think of Senator Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, who's down and really is facing a fight of her life. And she's saying, you know what, even if this hurts me politically, I'm still still going to take this vote. Joe Manchin is obviously making a different decision. He says that it wasn't influenced by politics, but it's pretty clear that Joe Manchin was thinking about whether or not he'd get reelected when he thought about this vote.
Do you think, Yamiche, there will be any effect of Donald Trump Jr. essentially tweeting and trolling Joe Manchin by calling him out for this vote and asking West Virginians to vote for the Republican candidate for Senate?
I think that it's kind of remarkable to see the president's son, and maybe later we'll see the president do it, attack Joe Manchin when he voted for their Supreme Court nominee. But Joe Manchin is still a Democrat. He's still the D next to his name, and as a result, I'm more likely to see the president and other people attack him and try to get him out of office, because at the end of the day, Joe Manchin is voting for this Supreme Court justice, but it's not as if he's a reliable conservative vote that he's going to continue to be voting if the ACA comes up, or if they want border wall funding, or if they want to change the way women can have the right to choose for an abortion. There are all these different things that Joe Manchin could still vote against them on, so I think they still want him out of office.
Okay. Eugene, now, he has sidestepped answering the question directly, but we have the New York Times reporting that New York Congressman Jerry Nadler is promising to investigate Judge Kavanaugh if the Democrats win control of the House in November. What is it exactly that Democrats would seek to find out, and then how do you see that playing out? Is it realistic to expect an investigation that could potentially end with impeachment proceedings?
I think it's something that many voters who do not support Kavanaugh perhaps would hope would be the case. I don't know how realistic it is to expect that Kavanaugh would go all the way to impeachment. But many Democratic lawmakers had lots of questions about the investigation, more questions than answers, quite frankly. I heard Democratic lawmakers say they don't even know who was and who was not interviewed by the FBI, and want to know why the FBI did not interview these people. They don't know the procedure of the investigation, what role the White House played in everything, and just wanted to get to the bottom of it. And so I think on some level it's not even about Kavanaugh as much as how things were operated and what their lawmakers on the other side of the aisle did or did not do to get the answers that many of the people paying attention to this whole situation were demanding.
What do you think the probability is, Yamiche, of things rising to that level? And we should say that Nancy Pelosi has said that if she were to retain and return to being the Speaker of the House, that she would not want to pursue impeachment proceedings.
I think Democrats don't want to talk about impeachment proceedings at all. They don't want to talk about it when it comes to the president. They're not going to want to talk about it when it comes to Brett Kavanaugh, because that topic energizes Republicans. There are people who will then go to the polls and say, well, if we're talking about now losing a Supreme Court justice nominee and really tying up this president, I need to go out and support President Trump. If they wait until after and decide to impeach Brett Kavanaugh after, that might be the case. I will say that Democrats have a long, long list of investigations that they would open up if they got back to House. We're thinking about the president's tax returns. We're thinking about whether or not his children working for him is a problem and whether or not it violates any rules. And then you think about Brett Kavanaugh. So there's so many things that they would have to look into if they got the House back.
I want to ask you both about where enthusiasm stands right now. To you first, Eugene. Do you get a sense that Republicans are inspired and they'll get to the polls as a result of all this? I mean, we've got 4+ weeks. We've got to hang on with whatever enthusiasm there is on both sides of the aisle. Or Democratic voters, are they feeling deflated by all of this? I mean, how do you read the enthusiasm quotient?
Conservative voters that I spoke with this week were definitely energized and will mobilize themselves from this week, combined with, you remember the reports regarding the economy being doing incredibly well because unemployment numbers are so low. Their morale has been really rough for Republicans for a while, and whether or not this can continue for the next several weeks, whether or not Trump won't do something that disrupts this type of support is to be determined. But I think there's a win, especially if you look at a lot of the never Trump conservatives. They see Trump delivering in ways that they were hoping that he would, that they weren't sure that he would, but that he certainly has seemed to be able to. Okay.
Final word to you, Yamiche, quickly on this.
Well, the nomination really became a rallying cry for Republicans. There was a new poll out by PBS NewsHour, NPR, and Marist, and we found that the enthusiasm cap that we saw this summer, there was a 10-point advantage to Democrats. They were more excited about the midterms. That's all but evaporated. Now more than 80% of Republicans and more than 80% of Democrats all say that they think this midterm election is very important. So that's bad news for Democrats.
Yamiche Alcindor, Eugene Scott, always good to talk with the both of you. Thank you so much. And, of course, just a few minutes ago, we heard from Melania Trump, this on her overseas trip in Egypt. She was answering some questions about the Christine Blasey Ford accusations. We didn't get to hear it then. Let's take a listen now.
If we're talking about the Supreme Court and Judge Kavanaugh, I think he's highly qualified for the Supreme Court. I'm glad that Dr. Ford was heard. I'm glad that Judge Kavanaugh was heard. FBI investigation was done, is completed, and Senate voted.
Did you believe Christine Ford?
I will move on that, I think all the victims, we need to help all the victims, no matter what kind of abuse they had. But I'm against any kind of abuse or violence.
All right, Melania Trump there just speaking moments ago. She's wrapping up her trip to the African continent there in Cairo, Egypt. Democratic Congressman from Missouri, Emanuel Cleaver, is joining me now. So, sir, with a welcome to you. Let's talk about an investigation, one that would be proposed potentially by your Democratic colleague there in the House, Gerald Nadler. Is that a wise idea, or is it better to just move on, as has been suggested by many on this broadcast thus far?
Well, Jared Nadler is one of the smartest members of the Democratic caucus. He is brilliant, and most of us are awed by his intelligence. And so I think he's not prone to make stupid statements, particularly on the air. However, I think that at this point, 31 days out, or whatever we are from the November elections, maybe we ought to talk about the issues that we intend to promote, more so than the individuals who will be investigated. I don't think that that's in our best interest at the moment to do that. In fact, it may be something that will hurt us by talking about investigations and impeaching Donald Trump. All of those things, I think, are further dividing the nation. And then more importantly, I think that it might create an inspiration for the Republicans that I don't want to give them.
But I think at the root of what Gerald Nadler is suggesting, sir, I want to give the quote to what he says. We're going to have to do something to provide a check and balance to protect the rule of law and to protect the legitimacy of one of our most important institutions. So, truth is, we had hearings, we had an FBI investigation, however that is deemed to be assessed thorough or not, and there is going to be a vote. If Kavanaugh gets the votes, which it certainly looks like he's going to, doesn't that make him a legitimate justice? I mean, from what illegitimacy would the court need to be protected from?
Well, since President Trump has been in office, we've seen many of the socio-political institutions damaged, including the FBI and now the Supreme Court. And even the FBI again, because they should not have been given the orders to go out and do a limited investigation. Nobody would say that to the FBI. You'd say, go do an investigation. And so the president is constantly doing more and more damage to the institutions that we've come to respect and depend on. And so I think that what happened was awful. And at some point, it might absolutely be necessary for the judicial committee to do some investigations. More than that, in fact, I'm just saying that right now we have to do first things first. You know, my grandpa used to say, if you want rabbit stew, the first thing you got to do is catch the rabbit. So I think right now we're in the rabbit catching season. If we catch the rabbit, there are a lot of things we can do, but I don't want to give anybody else the motivation they need to come out and challenge me to do what I think the majority of the people in the country want, which is to reestablish the legitimacy of these institutions, including the Supreme Court. I am very disappointed in the Senate for Judge Kavanaugh. I mean, if you just think about what he said, he helped damage it when he said, what goes around comes around. I mean, here's a Supreme Court justice saying, I'm going to get you back. I mean, I have about 4 pretty close friends who are judges. I can't imagine any of them no matter how they're challenged, making those kinds of statements. It's awful that man will be on the Supreme Court next week.
I want to have a soundbite for you played right now. It's about the replacement of Anthony Kennedy from A Strong Voice and what this means for the court. Take a listen.
It's not so clear that, I think going forward, that sort of middle position, it's not so clear whether we'll have it. All of us need to be aware of that, every single one of us, and to realize how precious the court's legitimacy is.
Associate Justice Lena Kagan there, someone who will be a colleague in a matter of hours, potentially officially, with Brett Kavanaugh. Does the court really need a middle position to work effectively, or is this being put out there because Kavanaugh is the nominee of Donald Trump?
No, we need a middle position. I think most of America hangs out in the middle politically. They're not going to extremes to the right or the left. And so we need somebody who can balance the court and who might look at the matters that come before the high court in terms of, I want to make sure that both sides are getting the position out. But I want to come down in accordance with the law and in harmony with where the American people might be. And in some cases that's not going to be possible. But I do think we need somebody who can balance things out. I think what Mr. Trump wanted was someone who was going to create an imbalance, particularly if the court has to hear anything from the Mueller investigation related to him or his family. I mean, there are probably 100 judges who could have qualified to go to the court and who would have been conservative but balanced and who would not have said they were going to come back and get people on one side. And I think this is very dangerous. I know that they're celebrating at the White House. I was listening to Mrs. Trump. Maybe she ought to be the director of communications because she is doing a much better job than the people in the White House, who I think are systematically dividing the nation.
Democratic Congressman from Missouri, Emanuel Cleaver, thank you very much for your time here on this Saturday morning. 1 month from today, the battle for control of Congress will be decided. In just a moment, my colleague Steve Kornacki has the very latest read on how voters are leaning, particularly in the Senate. 34 past the hour, senators still speaking on the Senate floor just hours now before Judge Brett Kavanaugh's final confirmation vote is expected around 5 p.m., though some suggest it could happen in the latter part of the 4 p.m. hour today. It may be a bit too early to gauge just how big of an impact the confirmation fight will have on the midterms, although there are recent polls which show it is at this point helping Republicans close the enthusiasm gap. No better person to turn to than my colleague Steve Kornacki, MSNBC national political correspondent and author of the new and terrific book, The Red and the Blue. Okay, I want to bring you in because we have you positioned there before your magic board. Confirmation of Kavanaugh, Steve, there was talk that it would send the Democrats to the polls in droves. But do you still think Republicans are going to come out, even though he is poised to win? Has this been a big enthusiasm generator?
And that's the key question. It feels like if the election was going to be held today, that surge from Republican base voters that Republicans have been hoping for might actually be there. And then they might be able to keep the House, might be able to gain some seats in the Senate, a couple seats in the Senate. But that is the wild card. Events move so fast in politics right now that 3 weeks ago, we were all talking about Manafort and Cohen and Trump's reaction to the McCain funeral.
That is really a question that I've been hearing a lot over the last week.
Eddie, this last part of what Natasha's saying there, how do Democrats now interpret the loss after seeing the president use these tactics of coming out and really bullying someone, making fun of someone who has suffered an element of sexual attack on her, and when?
Well, I think to echo David Jolly, I think they can conclude that there is no moderate wing of the Republican Party any longer, that the Republican Party is fully Trump's party, and they have to deal with them as such. I think the Democratic Party faces what might be called a kind of rhetorical pincer move. The Republicans are brilliant at declaring the spoils of victory, and then when faced with political power, they can cry victim. And so, you know, you saw it with Lindsey Graham, right? That is to say, the consequences of elections is that we get to appoint our judges. And then when accusing the Democrats of dropping this last-minute accusation, quote-unquote last-minute accusation against Brett Kavanaugh, he clutched his pearls and cried victim. And so there's a rhetorical way in which the Democrats are always backed into a corner. They have to stop playing checkers and start playing chess. And beyond that, what we see across the country, Alex, is that everyday ordinary folk who are those unlikely voters, they're going to come out and they're going to respond to what the Republicans have done. I think they're going to respond to Trumpism, and we're going to see something fundamentally. We're seeing a fundamental political realignment, and it's going to take place beginning in the midterms.
Yeah. So to that extent, Chris, if the Democrats win the House, we've heard Congressman Gerald Nadler vowing to launch a Judiciary Committee investigation into Kavanaugh. What kind of a threat, if any, does that really pose to Kavanaugh if he's already been confirmed and he's sitting on the court?
Not much of a threat, I don't think. And I think it would be a huge mistake for the Democrats to keep fighting the last battle. It's time for them to move on. I disagree with what some have said here. I think it's going to be much more galvanizing this past week for the Democrats than for the Republicans. But having said that, it'd be a huge mistake for the Democrats to focus on fighting this war over Kavanaugh again. What the Democrats, you know, I think, look, the Ronan Farrows and the Jane Mayers of this world and other journalists may well come up with some kind of bombshell. Barring that, short of that, the Democrats need to focus on a couple of things like a laser. They need to focus on protecting the Mueller investigation, and they need to develop a clear message for the primaries and for the re-election. And I think that message needs to be making the economy work for more than just the top 1%, protecting health care, protecting coverage for pre-existing conditions, and restoring honesty to the White House. They've got to move past Kavanaugh.
Natasha, you have an article in The Atlantic. It is titled, "The FBI Investigation Didn't Go Very Far by Design." And in this article, you point out that Republicans like Susan Collins considered it as a very thorough investigation, even though only 9 of dozens of potential corroborators, character witnesses, and the like were investigated. How do you make sense of that? Does it leave room for a significantly different investigation by a democratically controlled House Judiciary Committee?
It could. I mean, I agree with Chris when he says that it's really kind of pointless for Democrats to beat a dead horse here. But yeah, I mean, the FBI investigation was, for all intents and purposes, a sham. It wasn't really a legitimate, thorough investigation. And people that I've been speaking to say that FBI agents are really frustrated by this. The director even is very frustrated by this because they knew all along that their hands were going to be tied, that they were being used by the White House, in a sense, and by the Senate to give them cover to confirm and support Brett Kavanaugh. But this was never going to be the thorough investigation that Democrats and that Christine Blasey Ford and that the other accusers wanted. Christine Blasey Ford offered 20 witnesses, 20 people who could corroborate her testimony. So did Debbie Ramirez, the accuser from Yale, who said that Brett Kavanaugh exposed herself. So combined, there were over 40 people that the FBI could have spoken to, but not that they didn't want to, but that they just couldn't. The White House and the Senate limited the scope of what the FBI could investigate, and ultimately the White House is the FBI's client here. So there was really nothing that they could do, and I think that's why there's been so much consternation within the Bureau over just, you know, having been used by the president as a bogeyman in the Russia investigation, and now they're again at the center of this political firestorm with the Kavanaugh confirmation hearing. They sense that they're being tossed around as a political football here, and that they're always perpetually in a no-win situation.
Natasha Bertrand, Chris Ripple, Eddie Glaude. I won having the three of you to talk about this, so thank you so much. Good to see you all.
Thanks, Alex.
A warning from a current member of the Supreme Court about Kavanaugh and the balance of ideologies. That's next. And then at 9:30, Steve Cornell. New reaction this morning from both sides of the aisle to the much maligned FBI report about sexual assault allegations against Brett Kavanaugh. Let's take a listen.
I thought the FBI report was very thorough.
What we know for sure is the FBI report did not corroborate any of the allegations against Judge Kavanaugh.
The public can't see it. It's a complete sham.
The idea that senators were given 60 minutes to look at a report that we had to tear apart and share one page at a time so that we could read enough of it to be credible before our 60 minutes was up was humiliating and embarrassing to the United States Senate.
Joining me now is former Assistant Special Watergate Prosecutor and former federal prosecutor Nick Ackerman. Nick, with a big welcome to you here. You just heard Senate Democrats calling the FBI's limited investigation a sham. If Democrats win control of the House, they could consider impeachment proceedings. How would impeaching a Supreme Court justice work? Do you think that Brett Kavanaugh could find himself back in front of the Senate for a trial?
Well, that's possible. First, it works just like it would work in impeaching the president. There has to be first a vote of impeachment in the House of Representatives, which means they have to put together evidence. I think in this case, the only evidence that would make for any kind of impeachable offense here would be if they could show conclusively that Brett Kavanaugh lied in his confirmation hearings. But then you'd have to go to the Senate, where you need a two-thirds majority to convict. And I think that's almost impossible. I really don't think impeachment is going to go anywhere here. You're not going to come up with the conclusive evidence that you need to say that he conclusively lied before the Senate. I think this would be a fool's errand at this point.
I was going to say my previous guests all were unanimous in that same thought, that just move on. This is not something to pursue. That said, during the confirmation hearings, Kavanaugh, as you know, very much an advocate of presidential immunity from prosecution. He refused to answer the questions about whether or not he would recuse himself from any cases that were tied directly to President Trump and potentially Robert Mueller's investigation here. Now, after the testimony, there are new questions about impartiality that have come up regarding Brett Kavanaugh. So if he gets confirmed, should he recuse himself from any decisions involving the president?
Yeah, absolutely he should recuse himself. I mean, let's look at why he was appointed in the first place. He was not even on the president's initial list of potential appointees during the election. It was only afterwards that the president put his name on the list when he learned that Brett Kavanaugh was one against investigating the president, was basically saying a president shouldn't be indicted, that he was against U.S. v. Nixon, where Nixon was forced to turn over his tapes. So he's already taken a very strong position on all of these constitutional issues that relate to the president. When we're talking about a Supreme Court justice, we want somebody who is going to be fair and impartial and comes to an issue without preconceived notions. Here, Brett Kavanaugh has already made it very clear where he would come out on each of these issues.
And his future colleague, Elena Kagan, is speaking out about that. I'm just looking and paraphrasing what she said, but she says part of the court's strength and legitimacy depends on people seeing the court in this way, and that it is, yes, it's an extension of politics to agree, but it somehow remains above the fray. Does Brett Kavanaugh's being seated on this court challenge what she said the Supreme Court stands for and should be perceived as?
Oh, there's no question. Just by virtue of his last testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee and his attack on the left-wing conspiracy and on groups that were opposing his nomination, coming out as an extreme partisan is not a good thing for the court. Now, keep in mind, in the past, we've had people appointed to the court that weren't even judges. You had Earl Warren, who was a Republican governor of California that was appointed by Dwight D. Eisenhower. You had Arthur Goldberg, who was an experienced lawyer who was appointed by John F. Kennedy, or maybe it was Lyndon Johnson, to the U.S. Supreme Court. They were not coming in as extreme partisans. In fact, their decisions on the court showed that they could act impartially and fairly. I think part of our problem is we've gotten away from the way we used to